Thanks for sticking around for part 2, and we're going to pick up exactly where we left off with Alasdair Macleod and this in-depth review of Gold is Money. Thank you very much. Exactly. Now, as far as Russia, last September, Russia announced an agreement that they had made with China. Russia currently, according to World Gold Council numbers, they mine about approximately 250 tons of gold a year. And they agreed to sell China up to 100 tons a year. Their target was 80 to 100 tons. Now, the question that I have, Russia has been acquiring approximately 15, 18 tons a month every month, somewhere around 200 tons a year. Yeah. Out of the 250 tons. Now, I'm not sure if that's coming from the open market. I would presume that it comes from their internal mining efforts because none of that gold ever leaves. So if they're taking 200 tons of the 250, that leaves 50 tons in limbo, but yet they have agreed to sell to China 80 to 100 tons a year. And and when they made this announcement, it was already on. They had already made their first exchange. So I'm not sure. What is your take on what that whole situation is about?
Yeah. Okay. This is more about the control of the markets in gold. Up until China really got going with the Shanghai Gold Exchange, of course, the markets were London, the LBMA, and also COMEX was particularly, the futures and options market for gold. So China actually had very, very little control over the markets for gold as such, other than her own demand and other than the supply to her domestic population. Since then, she has made a number of moves to try and internationalize her control over the gold markets, extending it from the Shanghai Gold Exchange to the Shanghai Futures Exchange. Through Hong Kong, they bought the London Metal Exchange, and the London Metal Exchange has recently launched LME Precious, which is a gold contract and a silver contract, and I think 2 platinum contracts as well. Which incidentally is trading quite actively, which is amazing. But the reason it's trading actively, guess why, is because ICBC, which is one of the sponsors of this contract, is trading quite actively. That, in other words, a Chinese state bank is ensuring that the market, the LME market, works. Now, extending from there, another aspect of this is you've got the Moscow Gold Exchange, and what you're describing basically is the tie-up between the Moscow Gold Exchange and the Shanghai Gold Exchange, the international side of it. And so Moscow has become a member of Shanghai, and the amount of gold that you're referring to, I think, is, if you like, a sort of an intention of supply of domestic gold, domestic mined gold, that will probably go through the Shanghai Gold Exchange. So I think the way to look at it is not to get too excited about those numbers. The thing to get excited about is that suddenly we see that China and Russia between them now pretty well control the world's physical gold market.
I kind of like the sound of that because I don't know what they're going to do with it. I know what's currently being done to the markets. There are no markets. There's only, as Chris Powell has described for years, there are no markets, only intervention. And that's exactly what we've had for far too long. And let's give somebody else a chance. Let's give somebody else an opportunity to see what they bring to the table. Are they going to bring more criminals to engulf the market and control it and treat it the way they want? I don't know. I'm willing to give them a chance, though.
Well, I think we're talking about two different markets. The interventions that Chris Powell so rightly refers to is very rarely in the physical market. It's almost always in the futures markets on COMEX, and if it's not the Fed itself, it's if you like the Fed's epigones, the banks which the Fed or the U.S. Treasury, if you like, effectively licenses. So that is where the intervention occurs. But the control of the physical market has now moved away. And I think the other thing is it's interesting seeing that some of the banks that are members of the new exchanges, we're looking at HSBC in particular, which of course has roots in Hong Kong,
right,
and Shanghai. It was originally the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, and also I see that some of the other banks like Goldman Sachs are very much getting involved in those markets as well. And we're all very cynical, if you like, about these banks that do God's own work. But having said that, I do observe this with some interest. I think that the one thing I would say about Goldman Sachs is that they are immensely commercial. And they understand how to make money for themselves. And the fact that they are moving into areas of physical gold trading, I think it's just indicative of where everything is going. Really, when it comes to intervention, I think the days of intervention, they're continuing, but they're slowly drawing to a close. I can't see that the banks that run COMEX will have too much control over gold prices in the future. The other thing that's happening, which is making it very difficult for America, is that China is now the biggest international trader. She is by far the biggest user of oil, for example, imported oil. She also is the largest user of copper, zinc, nickel, and all the rest of it. Now, the Chinese economy actually is going pretty well, and the Chinese government is pursuing its 13th five-year plan. Pretty well on course. It's improved the rail connections between China and Europe, for example. The thing that is absolutely amazing is that last year the number of trains that went between China and Europe were over 1,700 trains.
Oh my!
So this is quite something. And at the moment, it takes roughly 15 days for a 7,500 mile trip. They're going to get that down to 10 days. When you compare that with a container ship leaving Shanghai and assuming she goes through Suez, that's going to take the thick end of 40, 50 days. So the amount of saving, the speed with which goods are being shifted across Europe is really accelerating now. And of course, this doesn't hit the headlines, but it really does mean that the global action, if you like, economic progress is all happening in Asia. It's not happening in America. So what America is now seeing is that she's got a weak dollar, courtesy of politics as much as anything, and the fact that the dollar was ramped too high to begin with. And she's got rising commodity prices, even denominated in Chinese yuan. So if you're going to get rising commodity prices on a stagnant economy in America, then you have got all the hallmarks of what we used to call stagflation. What happens basically is the purchasing power of the dollar starts going down. Now, under those circumstances, I think the ability of the banking members of COMEX to suppress the price of gold, I think it's going to be very, very much compromised. I don't think they'll be able to do it for very much longer.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that, or I foresee actually, the pricing mechanism being moved out of COMEX and probably onto the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Or is that just pie in the sky?
Well, at the moment, it's pie in the sky because, in the West, we follow COMEX. It's actually as simple as that.
Right.
When it comes to physical gold, it is not yet in China's interest to start really commanding the price. If it did that, it would be driving up the price. I would see that as almost a strategic nuclear option as it were, which they would be very reluctant to do. You have to bear in mind that the Chinese approach to their evolution into a dominant power over Asia is something that they almost achieve by default. They let the other imperial countries make all the mistakes, and in this case, I'm particularly saying America. All they need to do is just sort of sit back, let America make the mistakes, and the ball rolls their way. And that's broadly been their policy. The election of Trump, I think, has potentially changed this. There have been moments, particularly when the North Korean situation was escalated, and there was, the threat that the Americans would invade North Korea and take it over because they reckon the Chinese weren't doing enough to strangle the North Korean economy. I think that from China and Russia's point of view, they would not want to see American troops on their border, because that was, because the North Korean border abuts both China and Russia. It's a very small border with Russia, but it's quite big with China. And not only that, but it's about 150 miles from Beijing. So, this is like having China in Alaska, as far as you're concerned, and quite a bit worse. So looking at it from that point of view, I think that if America tried that, and Trump could well still try it, I think that would rebound very, very badly on the dollar. I think that the dollar would get dumped big time, and the price of gold would rise.
Yeah, I would think that if they tried something, if these idiots in Washington, D.C. actually set that in motion, I think that what you just said would be spot on. That China and Russia in conjunction would just dump the dollar and just blow our economy to shreds. I mean, because like you said, that's a nuclear option, and when that happens, if they were to make a serious move towards North Korea, and Xi Jinping has made it very clear that the United States is to stay out. We've got it. It's not a problem. We have this situation. I mean, is that right? I mean, that's what would happen. I mean, there wouldn't have to be any weapons used. They would just dump the dollar and blow things apart.
Yeah, absolutely. The military strategists in the Chinese People's Liberation Army take exactly that view. They do not see that China would win a direct confrontation with America. I mean, their technology, their military technology, has advanced hugely, but we're talking about a country that spends a far smaller portion of its taxes on the armed forces and equipping them with, if you like, really super duper weapons.
Yeah.
So they're not going to go that route. But the thing they do know is that they can actually screw the West just basically through currency manipulation, and particularly manipulation of the gold price.
If they were to revalue gold, say, I mean, it's at what, 12.25 or whatever they beat it down to today, and they were to wake up tomorrow morning and say, well, if you want gold on the Shanghai Gold Exchange, it's actually going to be $4,000 an ounce.
I don't think that's quite how they do it. I actually wrote an article on this, I think about a month ago. So I researched this in some depth. I think that the way they would do it is they would announce a level of gold reserves which would be considerably in excess of the current level. And they would wait to see how the market would treat that. The intention basically being to put the yuan on a gold exchange standard. Now, what I mean by that is that once the price is settled at a level which the market would be happy with for such a standard to exist, then it would be introduced. So the first thing you do is you announce, we have 15,000 tons of gold, which we're now crediting to the People's Reserve Account, or the Sovereign Wealth Fund, whatever it is. That will be available as reserves. The second thing they would announce is a perpetual bond, which is redeemable in gold. Now, the point is that if you do that, you set the interest rate at something like 4 or 5%, compared with the current interest rate on gold, which, if you look at the rate in London, is around about 1.4, 1.5%. If you offer a coupon, if you like, in a gold bond, an irredeemable gold bond, at above that, then effectively that bond is as good as gold. You would use the proceeds of that bond for two things. I think the first thing is that you would probably have to support some of the local, the regional governments, which would undoubtedly be in some difficulties. The other thing you do is that you use some of the proceeds, if you like, as seed corn money for the rapid expansion of infrastructure throughout Asia. So you've got a use for it. That I don't think is a problem. What is interesting is that the way I came up with this model was by analysing what happened in Britain. Before the Napoleonic Wars, Britain issued the first bond called Consols, and the Consols 2.5% bond was issued with a 2.5% coupon. You had gold convertibility, if you like, was stopped through the Napoleonic Wars. It came back after the Napoleonic Wars. Now, what happened was that people made absolute fortunes by buying this bond when it yielded 5%. In other words, the price had pretty well halved from 100, from par at 100 down to 50. This was extremely important, because what it did was it gave quite a lot of wealth into the private sector, which helped finance the Industrial Revolution that particularly occurred after 1830, after the Corn Laws had been repealed. So this is a very, very interesting way of doing it. And I can see the Chinese, I hope they understand this, and I hope they're listening to this conversation, but that is what they should do. It is a model that has worked before. It was a model that effectively was the financial driver behind the Industrial Revolution, giving wealth, if you like, to the capitalists who needed to, open factories, needed to develop markets, and all the rest of it. China is exactly the same, in exactly the same position. It is now less dependent on exports to countries like America. There's no doubt about it that a far higher yen-dollar rate is going to make it uneconomic to manufacture for export to America, of goods. It's certainly initially, but once the thing is settled down, then that's not really a problem. So I can see that there is a way in which this happens, and I think that we're probably not a huge distance away from the Chinese doing something on the lines which I've just debated. There is another aspect of this which is worth mentioning, and that is that China's partner in this, Russia, is now the largest single exporter of oil in the world. And one of the contracts, one of the yuan contracts due to be listed on the futures exchange in Shanghai is the yuan gold contract. They've already got the yuan gold contract going, so that you can see that oil producers in the fullness of time will be able to hedge their oil, which they're delivering to China, directly into gold. So you can see that everything is beginning to work towards gold payments, and therefore the currency has to be on a gold standard.
Won't that effectively kill the petrodollar?
Yes.
if there's a yuan oil contract, a yuan gold contract, who's gonna take Federal Reserve notes? Nobody.
Oh. Well, you're absolutely. This is, you put your finger on the point, and this is why the Chinese are actually very cautious about the pace in which they're likely to introduce this new gold contract. They've actually put it off for over a year now. Somebody told me the other day, a journalist on the ground, that they were actually training people up to deal in the yuan gold contract on the Shanghai Gold Exchange. First I'd heard of it. I don't know whether it's true. This is a journalist, a reputable journalist, who happened to be pumping me for some information, and he gave this information back. So the whole situation is, I think, moving towards some sort of climax in the next year or two. And you're absolutely right. I think a yuan gold contract, if it gains liquidity, would effectively mark the end of the petrodollar. As far as this is you're bringing in another subject, and that is Saudi Arabia, which is in enormous difficulties financially.
Yes,
they're pretty well bust, and they don't export any oil to America at all. There is really, in that sense, no reason for them to have a petrodollar. They need help pretty desperately, and guess what? Your friendly Chinaman round the corner is probably there saying, "How can I help?
What can I do for you?"
Well, exactly. I think they're likely to, that one of the things they're trying to sell a 5% stake in Saudi Aramco for $200 million. Now, there's a big problem with that deal, and that is that the Saudis are going to have to let someone audit their oil reserves. And it is an open secret that Saudi Arabia has overstated its oil reserves by a massive amount.
Yes.
So consequently, I can't see that it's going to be easy for them to list that Saudi Aramco deal. But, if I was a friendly Chinaman, I would say, well, here's a basis for working together. Let's put it that way. And of course, that again, I think, would have fairly significant ramifications in terms of the long-term future of the dollar. I mean, from my point of view, everything I look at in terms of the dollar as a reserve currency, I see reasons why there's going to be a flow back of dollars from abroad back into America. And I think that flow back, it can happen quickly, it can happen very slowly. We just don't know. At the moment, it's happening pretty slowly. And nobody's sort of panicking. They're still running their accounts in dollars for their international business and all the rest of it. But I think that's likely to start changing. And I mean, particularly amongst the commodity exporters who are increasingly being pressured by China to deal in yuan. I'm not saying that, Australian mining companies are going to be running their international operations directly in yuan, but you can see that there is pressure mounting for them to be less reliant on the dollar.
Yes.
And to the extent they're less reliant on the US dollar, then that is going to be sold down.
It sounds like, what you just described, Alasdair, is a Federal Reserve note that is about 95+% surrounded. There's very few exit gates for the Federal Reserve note, the world reserve currency, which it's really not. It's in all these banks around the world, but it's the way that it's being used is a lot different today than it was even 20 years ago, and China has made sure of that. So you said that this change could happen very slowly, which it is currently, or it could happen very rapidly. Is there 5 years left of life in this thing?
Well, I think it's down. I think it's down to geopolitics again. If the Trump presidency starts panicking on North Korea or whatever, and incidentally, he's very sensibly withdrawn from Syria. But
Yes.
that leaves. That's actually, Syria is extremely important because that's the European end, the Mediterranean end, as it were, rather than the European end, but the Mediterranean end of the Silk Road. This is important. This is very, very important. And indeed, if you go back to the original Silk Road, this was the sort of route that Marco Polo used, sort of going, or if you like, traders at that time, rather than Marco Polo himself. He actually went by a slightly different route. But traders in Marco Polo's day would go to places, like Aleppo was a main staging point on the way back from China. So silk goods would go through Aleppo and all that. And part of the reason that cities like Damascus and Aleppo have been so fabulously wealthy over the years is because of this huge, great Asian trade route that has existed really since time immemorial. There are sort of various ends of the route, as it were, on the European side and the Mediterranean side. But you've now got the bridge, in effect, across from Iran, really from Tibet through Afghanistan, through Iran, and then through Syria. And you've got access to the Mediterranean. I mean, this is actually a very important development, which has just completely disappeared from the news.
Yes.
I think that going back to your question about how rapidly this might happen, we need to monitor very, very closely the inside story, not the outside story, but the inside story on what's really going on the geopolitical scene between America, Russia, and China. If you can get a handle on that, you will know what the risks are of something being precipitated early as opposed to just following its natural course.
Okay. I like it. Any kind of road mark that we can find is positive, because people, as I just did with you, when's this thing going to come to an end? I mean, so any type of road mark that we can find that gives us a clue to what's actually happening, because as you've pointed out several times during this conversation, well, that's not being reported. Well, there's no news on that, or that's nothing but a bunch of propaganda coming from, the fake news sources. I mean,
yes, there's a lot of that.
there's plenty of that. I mean, and the thing is that that's done for a reason, and that's to hide these road markers that say, here's what this just happened. So effectively, we have three options from here, and 1, 2, 3, and this is what they look like. And if 1 happens, then A should be the next step. If 2 happens, then this should be the next step. If 3 happens, this should be the next step. I mean, we have to have that in order to be able to properly protect ourselves, our families, our communities, because nobody else is going to do it. They're not looking out for us. They don't care about you. They don't care about me. They just see us as an ATM, and how much wealth can they extract from us and then throw us in the dump. And that's it.
Well, they've got a problem. Governments do have a huge problem, and that is that being welfare states, the net present value of all those future liabilities is horrendous. And at the same time, you've got all the power plays in government, which are not helping. And we see this with the deep state versus Trump. Really, the way I read it is that you've got the defense establishment, the defense manufacturers, who need to sell product to the government in order to continue to make profits. That's fine. I can understand that. But what I think is completely wrong in this is that they should have the influence on the government to divert government money into those warlike uses, if you like, at a time when the amount of money that the Treasury actually requires to cover all those future liabilities is just sort of rocketing completely out of control.
Yes.
Someone at some stage has got to turn around and say, well, we've got to take control of government finances. And part of that control of government finances is not indulging in flights of fancy, in expensive wars abroad. Right.
I mean, these guys, the reason that Syria was important, the reason Iraq, Iran, just pick somebody that we've blown up recently. The only reason that they're important is, well, Syria because of the oil and the pipelines and the Silk Road. But for the most part, these guys need an enemy in order to be able to produce, $60 million contracts, $150 million contracts for, $1 billion plane that doesn't fly. I mean, all of these toys, I shouldn't call them toys, all of these mechanisms of death and destruction have to continually be produced in these contracts, just like you said. They need another contract in order to keep themselves alive. And there has to be a shift. There's got to be a shift from death and destruction to peace and prosperity. There has to be. I mean, otherwise, we ain't going to make it.
Well, I think yes, I would agree with that. But it's unfortunately I don't associate sort of peaceful progress with government. If anything, they encourage very much the reverse.
Yes. Well, Alasdair, wow. I didn't mean to take up this much of your time this morning.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Rory.
I love it, and I apologize for not speaking with you a lot sooner. And I assure you that it won't be as long as the gap in between our last conversation. And we've been speaking with Alasdair Macleod. He's the head of research over at Gold Money. You can find all of his work, his great work, at wealth.goldmoney.com. Alasdair, thank you for all your time today.
That was my pleasure, Rory.